Hello students, this video is being recorded in the summer of 2020. Enjoy the lecture. So next we turn to Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream, this very well-known speech given on August 28, 1963, during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. In 1999, the I Have a Dream speech was ranked the #1 speech of the 20th century in a survey of 137 rhetoric and public address scholars in America. The full list of the top 100 speeches of the 20th century is available at the website American Rhetoric. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was born in 1929 on the 15th of January in Atlanta, Georgia. His birth name was given as Michael King Jr. Both his maternal grandfather and his father were pastors of the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. In the 1930s, his father made a trip to Germany to visit some of the historical sites associated with Martin Luther, the founder of the Protestant Reformation. When he returned from his trip, he changed his name and his son's name to Martin Luther King. In 1942, Martin Luther King Jr. began attending the Booker T. Washington High School in Atlanta, which was at the time a segregated high school. In high school, he was noted for his public speaking and debating ability, and in his junior year, he won first prize in an oratorical contest. He graduated high school in 1944 and that same year entered Morehouse College. He graduated from Morehouse with a BA in sociology in 1948 and in 1951 received his Bachelor's of Divinity degree from the Crozier Theological Seminary, where he was also elected as student body president. In 1951, Martin Luther King Jr. enrolled in the Boston University PhD program in systematic theology. While he was studying for his doctoral degree in Boston, he was occasionally a guest pastor at the 12th Baptist Church in Roxbury. In 1953, he married Coretta Scott, whom he met in Boston. She had been a student at the New England Conservatory of Music. In 1954, Martin Luther King Jr. was appointed minister of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. He was only at the time 25 years old. In 1955, he received his PhD in systematic theology from Boston University. And that same year, while he was still pastor at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, he organized the Montgomery bus boycott. This is the famous bus boycott from which we know the story of Rosa Parks. The bus boycott lasted 385 days. During the boycott, Martin Luther King's house was bombed on January 30th, 1956, but he responded with a message of nonviolence to his followers and supporters. In 1957, he helped to organize the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with Ralph Abernathy, Fred Shuttlesworth, and Joseph Lowery. Now we know that Martin Luther King is a great speaker, but what we may not realize is that he comes out of a great speaking tradition in the black church in the American South, and he was widely recognized not only as a civil rights leader, but as a great Christian preacher. Here's an excerpt of an early sermon from Martin Luther King from 1957, after he returns from a trip to the African nation of Ghana, which had recently achieved its independence. You'll see in this excerpt how he easily blends both the Christian message and the civil rights appeal.
I want to take just a few more minutes as I close to say 3 or 4 things that this reminds us of, and things that it says to us, things that we must never forget, as we ourselves find ourselves breaking loose from an evil Egypt, trying to move through the wilderness toward the promised land of cultural integration. Ghana has something to say to us. It says to us first that the oppressor never voluntarily gives freedom to the oppressed. You have to work for it. Live in Chroma, and the people of the Gold Coast had not stood up persistently, revolting against the system, it would still be a colony of the British Empire. Freedom is never given to anybody, for the oppressor has you in domination because he plans to keep you there, and he never voluntarily gives it up. That is where the strong resistance comes. Privileged classes never give up their privileges without strong resistance. So don't go out this morning with any illusion. Don't go back into your homes and around Montgomery thinking that the Montgomery City Commission and that all of the forces in the leadership of the South will eventually work out this thing for Negroes. It's going to work out. It's going to roll in on the wheels of inevitability. If we wait for it to work itself out, it will never be worked out. Freedom only comes through persistent revolt, through persistent agitation, through persistently rising up against the system of evil. The bus protest is just the beginning. Buses are integrated in Montgomery, but that is just the beginning. And don't sit down and do nothing now because the buses are integrated. Because if you stop now, we will be in the dungeons of segregation and discrimination for another 100 years. And our children and our children's children will suffer all of the bondage that we have lived under for years. It never comes voluntarily. We've got to keep on keeping on in order to gain freedom. It never comes like that. It would be fortunate if the people in power had sense enough to go on and give up, but they don't do it like that. It is not done voluntarily, but it is done through the pressure that comes about from people who are oppressed.
So as we previously mentioned, in 1957, Martin Luther King and his wife traveled to Ghana for their independence ceremony. And there, as this picture shows, he met U.S. Vice President Richard Nixon. In 1958, Martin Luther King survived an assassination attempt during a book signing in Harlem. He was there to sign copies of Strides Toward Freedom, which was his account of the Montgomery bus boycott. A mentally deranged black woman who thought that King was conspiring with communists stabbed him in the chest with a letter opener. He spent several weeks in the hospital. In 1959, King traveled to India to further study the work of Mahatma Gandhi and nonviolent resistance. In 1960, Martin Luther King joined his father as the co-pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. In 1961, one of his many arrests, he was arrested in Albany, Georgia, protesting segregation. In 1963, he organized the Birmingham campaign, designed to protest segregation in Birmingham, Alabama. He was again arrested and wrote his famous Letter from Birmingham Jail. Later that year, on August 28, 1963, he delivered the famous I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington. We will turn to discuss that speech in more detail in a few moments. But before we do that, let's listen to Martin Luther King reading a few excerpts from his Letter from Birmingham Jail, August 16, 1963.
I'm in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the prophets of the 8th century BC left their villages and carried their "Thus saith the Lord" far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the Apostle Paul left his village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to the far corners of the Greco-Roman world, so am I compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my own hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid. We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward gaining political independence, but we still creep at horse and buggy pace toward gaining a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the sting dots of segregation to say wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness toward white people. When you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking, "Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean?" When you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you, when you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored, when your first name becomes nigger, your middle name becomes boy, however old you are, and your last name becomes John, and your wife and mother are never given the respected title Mrs., when you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly at tiptoe stands, never quite knowing what to expect next, and are plagued with inner fears and outer resentments, when you are forever fighting a degrading and degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over, and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. I hope, sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience.
Now, the letter from Birmingham Jail was a written and published piece of rhetoric. The recording of Martin Luther King reading the letter was made sometime later. In 1964, Martin Luther King received the Nobel Peace Prize, and in 1965 he participated in the Selma to Montgomery, Alabama March for Voting Rights. It was on the first of those marches, on March the 7th, 1965, that marchers, as they attempted to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, were met and beaten by local and Alabama State Police. In the top photograph here, you can see the recently deceased Congressman John Lewis, then a 25-year-old leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, being beaten by a police officer. 2 days later, Martin Luther King led another symbolic march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in support of voting rights for African Americans. In 1967, Martin Luther King came out publicly against the Vietnam War. This was a move which was consistent with his conscience, but which was criticized in the media and which cost him some popularity among the American public. In 1968, he helped to organize the Poor People's Campaign, and in April of 1968, he traveled to Memphis to support a strike by black sanitation workers in the city. On the night of April 3rd, he gave his famous "I've Been to the Mountaintop" speech. This was the night before he was assassinated. Martin Luther King died on April 4th, 1968, assassinated at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. He was 39 years old. Let's listen to an excerpt of his last oration.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
So now we turn to his great speech, "I Have a Dream," given on the 28th of August, 1963, at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., as part of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And we could ask, what is the genre of the speech? And then what is its exigence, audience, and constraints? In one sense, as King makes clear, the genre is meant to be epideictic. He marks the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation and identifies that as one of the chief reasons for holding the March on Washington on this particular date. In that sense, insofar as the speech is commemorative, we would identify it as epideictic. But it is also clear that the speech draws very much from the tradition of preaching in the African American church in the South. And so, in many ways, we could identify the genre as that of a sermon. The exigence here is the continuing injustice toward African Americans in the United States, and the need to make a bold statement about the necessity for civil rights for all Americans, especially Black Americans. The audience here, at least the immediate audience, is all those 250,000 people who attended the March on Washington. But there's an extended audience as well. King was clearly speaking to policymakers in Washington, including President Kennedy, and to the wider American public, who were paying attention to the civil rights movement in a way they had not been up until 1963. What are the constraints here? There are some generic constraints associated both with an epideictic occasion and with the sermon form with which Martin Luther King was very familiar. But there were also some ideological and political constraints as well. As a leader of the civil rights movement, King was receiving pressure from both sides of the ideological spectrum. He was being asked to moderate his message, especially by white policymakers in Washington, including some of those in the Kennedy administration. But there were also others within the civil rights movement who were advocating a far more militant and aggressive, even in some cases a violent push for Black civil rights. So King has to find the middle ground here. He has to find a way to express the necessity of justice without giving some of his political opponents ammunition to dismiss him as a radical or militant. So there are a number of critical questions that we could ask about Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream." We could begin by asking, what are the sacred texts of America's secular civil religion that King references and invokes, and how do those references and invocations advance his purpose in the address? So you will see several places in the speech where King refers to sacred American documents, such as the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Why does he do that? And then what are the various religious dimensions of King's speech? Why is it important to understand the religious elements of King's discourse? We talked about him coming out of the tradition of the African American church in the South, and we've mentioned that there are generic elements of the speech which remind us a lot of a sermon. But what are the other religious features of the text? Can you find the places in the speech where he quotes from the Bible or uses biblical phrasing in his own words? And what about the critical observation that King is speaking in the voice of a prophet? What are the aspects of the speech that remind you of its prophetic message? We can also observe that King uses a figure of speech by now which we're familiar with called anaphora, that repeated beginnings of successive sentences or the repetition of openings. He uses this figure of speech at several places in the address. But what does the anaphora accomplish? Perhaps the most famous example of anaphora in the speech is the refrain, "I have a dream." And then we could ask, what are the characteristics of most of King's metaphors? What do you recognize about the source of these images? That is, where is he drawing that imagery from? And what do you notice about the way they are constructed? What would the speech be like without metaphor? Furthermore, we could ask, how do references to time and history structure the reader's or the audience's experience of King's speech? How are time and history used creatively by King to organize his oration? And then, how do references to places, that is, geographical and spatial references, structure our experience of King's speech? What does the spatial movement of the speech contribute to its overall influence? You'll notice, for example, if you read the speech, that one of the places King refers to is New Hampshire. We could also ask, how important is the delivery of this address to its status as a great speech? Had the speech been merely an essay or an editorial in a magazine, such as the letter from Birmingham Jail, would it have had the same importance in American history? What difference does delivery make? And then finally, what is the central moral value at the core or foundation of King's appeal? What is the textual evidence that leads you to this conclusion? So before we take a look at the speech itself, let's examine the essay by Mark Vail entitled "The Integrative Rhetoric of Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech." And as Vail points out in his abstract, Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech exhibits an integrative rhetorical style that mirrors and maintains King's call for a racially integrated America, employing the theoretical concepts of voice merging, dynamic spectacle, and the prophetic voice. This essay examines how text and context converge to form a rhetorical moment consonant with the goals of the speech, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and the nonviolent direct action civil rights movement. So as Vail goes on to explain, he gives us a preview here of his essay. What he's going to show is first, King's practice of voice merging complemented the rhetorical situation in that the nature of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom itself reflected many of the characteristics of voice merging. And what Vail is referring to here is King's use of the words of others, both of biblical words, but also the words of iconic Americans like Abraham Lincoln and sacred American texts like the Declaration of Independence. Vail goes on to say, second, King's use of the prophetic voice served as the vehicle for integrating secular and sacred issues inherent in the struggle for civil rights. And so we've talked about this prophetic voice before, especially in connection with the speech by Angelina Grimke. And so in what fashion do we see Martin Luther King adopting that same kind of persona in the I Have a Dream speech? Vail continues, third, the dynamic spectacle of the march allowed King to accomplish this merger successfully. And here, Vail is focused on the relationship of the immediate context of the March on Washington with the I Have a Dream speech. Finally, Vail says, owing to the confluence of the integrative nature of the text and context, the I Have a Dream speech draws on the integrative rhetoric that was consonant with the integrationist aims of the nonviolent direct action civil rights movement and the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. So an important part of this analysis is Vail's focus on the relationship of the text and the context, or his examination of the rhetorical situation. Thoroughly appreciating the rhetorical impact of I Have a Dream requires a careful consideration of the contextual conditions and constraints that helped produce the speech. Examination of the rhetorical situation strongly suggests that some of the speech's success can be attributed to two antecedent events. The interrelatedness of these rhetorical and historical precedents created an integrative context for the speech that was consonant with the aims of the speech and helped pave the way for its popular approval. He goes on to explain that while it is not my intention to diminish the inestimable cultural impact of what is likely the most significant speech of 20th century America, I do suggest that two pivotal rhetorical events in the months preceding the march primed the public for the reception of this type of rhetoric. That the speech's rhetorical force is due as much to the shifting goals and the dynamic spectacle of the event as to the speech itself, and that the oration's success can be explained in part by the convergence of antecedent events and dynamic spectacle. In examining the various elements of the rhetorical situation, he looks carefully at the influence of the letter from Birmingham Jail on the I Have a Dream speech. Perhaps more significant for the movement was King's letter from Birmingham Jail, a written response to 8 Birmingham religious leaders who chastised King for bringing his nonviolent direct action movement to their city. He goes on to explain that a comparison of the letter and the dream reveals that many of the themes and stylistic devices employed in the I Have a Dream speech were hardly unique, but that is precisely why they gain rhetorical force. Their use in the dream speech links that text to the ideology of the letter. An effective written manifesto, the letter lacked the potency and power that only King's orality could supply. Thus, the March on Washington afforded King the opportunity to give voice to arguments penned in Birmingham 4 months earlier. On one front, the Birmingham text primed the rhetorical pump for King's August address. On another front, the attention generated by King's success in Birmingham, coupled with the concurrent publication and reception of the letter, helped to trigger political action by a reluctant Kennedy administration. Kennedy's pursuit of civil rights legislation would contribute to the changing nature of the march and the broader integrative context enveloping the I Have a Dream speech. Then Vail explores the important influence of the spectacle of the march and the huge crowd attending it on our reception and understanding of the I Have a Dream speech. The March on Washington was the largest single demonstration for civil rights in American history, drawing people from all walks of life in all parts of the country. Given Farrell's claim, and here he's talking not about me, but about Thomas Farrell, Given Farrell's claim that the spectacle relies on external factors as a substitute for intrinsic aesthetic integrity, the sheer visual impact of 250,000 people filling the vast expanse of the mall under the stony yet benevolent gaze of Abraham Lincoln would undoubtedly augment the gravity of the speeches delivered that day. The significance of the march as spectacle is supported by Hanson's comment that for some who heard King speak on a regular basis, the setting of his speech at the march made it memorable, but most of what he said was familiar. Furthermore, the speeches at the march were less important to many in the movement than the political meaning of a pro-civil rights demonstration of 250,000 people. The pressing question was how to channel the march's energy into practical action on civil rights, not which speeches, if any, would go down in history. Then Vail's analysis focuses on some of King's what he calls voice merging. In this brief passage, he talks about King's invoking of Abraham Lincoln. King opens the second paragraph of his speech with a call for social justice, immediately setting out to cast this call in a sacred light. Invoking the memory of Abraham Lincoln, King begins, 50 years ago, a great American, in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Vail says, note that King's appropriation of Lincoln's language, 50 years ago, is inspired not by the decree that ended slavery, but by the Gettysburg Address. King's references to Lincoln are hardly surprising considering the march's purpose and setting, and scholars have duly noted King's reference to the Emancipation Proclamation. But why does King conflate, if not fully integrate, Lincoln's two texts in one breath? The first reason for King to appropriate the Gettysburg Address is one of cultural familiarity. Lincoln's brief remarks on the Gettysburg battlefield are arguably his most famous and familiar. The Gettysburg Address had been taught in grammar schools throughout the country for many years, and school children were frequently conscripted to commit the speech to memory. And of course, we can note that in invoking Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and the other sacred texts of American civic religion, King is using sources that resonate deeply, not just with African Americans, but with all Americans. Vail summarizes his study by saying, the tightly woven relationship between text and context of Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech again demonstrates that a rhetorical artifact and a rhetorical situation are, to paraphrase King, tied up in a single garment of destiny. Beyond reaffirming an argument made by other rhetorical critics, I believe this study argues for the scholarly practice of integrating various theoretical lenses when studying a rhetorical artifact. Furthermore, it encourages critics to puzzle over how an artifact's rhetorical power is augmented by the performative interaction between text and context. That is, how does the interrelationship between text and context play out in the text? Finally, this study advances the notion of applying iconicity to the form and content of the rhetorical situation as a way to explain how context helps to shape a rhetorical act. In other words, how does the performative interaction of text and context construct a formal network of relationships that embody the meaning of a rhetorical act? So now let's listen to some excerpts from I Have a Dream and offer some commentary on those passages.
50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves. who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition.
So here in King's opening, or what we might call his exordium, we see that reference to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. In Lincoln, it was 77 years ago. For King, marking the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, it is 50 years ago. And then he makes reference to the Lincoln Memorial, the great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And then we also notice in the passage the first of what is many metaphors by Martin Luther King. He talks about a great beacon light of hope, the flames of withering injustice, the joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. In the next passage, he talks about how African Americans are crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. He refers to a lonely island of poverty and a vast ocean of material prosperity. Now, all of these images are metaphors, and what we notice about Martin Luther King's construction of metaphor is that he very often draws his imagery from nature or from what we would call archetypal sources, that is, ideas or images which are familiar across different cultures and throughout human history. Something like a beacon light, for instance, or something from nature like a joyous daybreak would be familiar to human beings everywhere at any time. And then we also notice that in constructing his metaphors, he makes them an explicit comparison. He gives us a figurative image such as manacles or lonely island or vast ocean, but then he gives us the explicit literal referent for that figurative image, as in segregation, poverty, and prosperity. Notice also that the metaphors tend to be applied to ideas that are abstract. Segregation or poverty or prosperity are more abstract ideas, whereas an island, an ocean, chains, manacles, these are concrete images. We see also here the first use of anaphora in the I Have a Dream speech. In this instance, it is the repetition of the phrase 100 years later. Note finally in this passage that King identifies one of the purposes for the March on Washington, as he says, "We've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition."
We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time The rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children.
In a similar way to the first passage that we looked at, this second passage has both metaphor and anaphora. We see the metaphors here: tranquilizing drug of gradualism, the dark and desolate valley of segregation, the sunlit path of racial justice, the quicksands of racial injustice, and the solid rock of brotherhood. And then another anaphora, the repetition of now is the time.
But that is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is
Now, in this passage, we see that King explicitly takes on the role as spokesperson for the African American people. He says, I must say to my people. And so also it's part of what he does to embody and express that persona of the prophet. We see again many more metaphorical passages, the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. So notice, for instance, with that palace of justice, justice is an abstraction, but palace is a concrete image, and the figurative image of palace is given explicitly with the literal referent of justice. And through these metaphors, King is also able to express clearly both his Christian theology and his philosophy of nonviolent resistance. He asks his audience, let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. He also, in this instance, has an example of antithesis. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds, as we saw with the Kennedy speech. That balancing of opposites we call antithesis.
There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied. As long as our body is heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream.
Now, in this passage, King begins another anaphora, but he starts that or introduces it with a rhetorical question put into the mouths of those who are critical of the civil rights movement. When will you be satisfied? And he responds with that anaphora, we can never be satisfied. And in the last instance of that, in the final sentence, he says, no, we are not satisfied and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. There again, invoking the prophet Amos from the Old Testament in a biblical reference.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Now, in this portion of the famous I Have a Dream passage, we see again I have a dream as an example of anaphora, one of many in the speech. But we see King also again invoking the sacred text of American civil religion. Here it's the Declaration of Independence. He says, one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. We see again several more instances of King's metaphors, the table of brotherhood, the state of Mississippi sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, and turned into an oasis of freedom and justice. So again, as it often is, the abstract literal is replaced by the concrete figurative, and both the literal and figurative imagery are present and explicit in the construction of the metaphor.
This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, my country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom reign. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
And then in these closing passages, we see King again invoking a sacred text from American civil religion, this time from the patriotic hymn America, sometimes called My Country 'Tis of Thee, but then also the use of another anaphora, taking a refrain from the hymn Let Freedom Ring and using that as the repeated introduction to several successive sentences. And each one of those sentences then takes us on a geographic survey of the American landscape. And where does it begin but in New Hampshire, from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire? King's I Have a Dream speech ends with this very stirring peroration or conclusion, as the speech is concluded not with reference to an American patriotic hymn, but with reference to the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. So there's our examination of Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. If you have questions or comments on this famous address, please post them to the discussion board.